Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we'll talk about global scope versus function scope. And the idea is simple and the video is short because I don't want to make it seem any harder than it really is. However, if you're coming from a programming background, JavaScript may not behave the way that you might expect it to in this regard. For example, if you're a C# or Visual Basic programmer, undoubtedly you have some familiarity with the notion of a block level scope. However, JavaScript has its own unique rules around scope, namely function scope, which disregards the block of code where a variable is declared and allows it to be used or referenced anywhere inside of the function. Now, if you're not already a programmer, scope simply refers to the context, or rather the availability of a given variable inside of your code. If the variable is defined with a global scope, it'll be available anywhere in your JavaScript code. And remember, the way you define a global variable is to simply start using it without the use of the var keyword. However, variables that are defined with the var keyword, function scope variables inside of a function, can only be seen and utilized inside of that function. So what we're going to do in this lesson is just create a couple of examples to fully flesh this out, and so we're on the same page and we understand the ins and outs of scope. And there might be a wrinkle or two as we continue on in this series, but I think we're going to find that those edge cases are fairly simple to understand once we get this basic concept down. So as you can see, I've already taken the liberty of getting started. I have used our template to create a new web page called c9js_10.html. I've already replaced the h1 in the title, and I've already added the script type equals text JavaScript and the closing script tag, and I'm ready to go. So please pause the video if you need to catch up, but please follow along. All right, I'm going to assume you're ready to go. So the first thing that we need to do is debunk the notion of block scope in JavaScript. So the easiest way that I can figure out to demonstrate this is to create a block, a simple block like the if statement. And inside of that if statement, I'm just going to create a variable x equals 5. Now in any other programming language, we would expect once we get outside of that block of code, once we exited that block of code, the variable x would no longer be available. However, in JavaScript, that's just not true. And to see that in action, I create an alert box to reference that variable x, and it displays 5 in a message box. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with. Now let's create a slightly more interesting set of examples here and actually start utilizing a global variable. So we're going to call this one myScope equals global. And then I'm going to create an anonymous function, and then I'm going to call that anonymous function immediately. We saw this in the previous lesson where we were looking at the different ways to create functions and to execute them. So just to set this up, there's my anonymous function, and I'm going to wrap it in a set of parentheses, and then I'm going to invoke this function immediately by using another set of parentheses, which in that case become the function invocation operators. All right. So then inside of this, what I want to do, first of all, is just let's alert and show the global scope. So inside the function, the scope is my scope. And then outside of the function, we'll do the same thing, except outside the function, the scope is my scope. Great. All right, so let's see what happens. All right, so inside the function, the scope is global, and outside the function, the scope is global. And that makes sense, right? Because we're dealing with a global variable, define it without the var keyword, and so it's available anywhere within our code. So now let's do this. I'm going to comment that out for the moment and not even reference it. Inside, I'm going to create a var myScope equals function. And then we're going to see if we can see that variable outside of the scope of the function. inside the function, the scope is function, and then we don't get a second alert box. And the reason is because my scope at this point is undefined. Therefore, this whole line of code is ignored by JavaScript because you can't append undefined to a string. There's no way to convert it. Two different types, I guess you would say. All right, so I guess that makes sense, right? Now let's do something else here. Let's uncomment out these the original declaration of my scope, the global declaration. Will we see the overwriting of my scope once we get down here back to the global scope? Let's see what happens. All right, so inside the function, the scope is function. So we overwrite the global variable in this case. But once we get outside of the function, notice that the variable's value goes back to its global value. All right. So I think that that is one of the key takeaways, that you can temporarily override the value of a variable by merely redefining it inside of a function, but it won't affect the variable outside of the scope of that particular function. We can reassign the value of a global variable inside of a function. So I set this inside the function. Save that and rerun it. All right, so inside the function, the scope is I set this inside the function, and globally it has been changed as well. All right, so that makes sense too, right? It's accessible. The global variable is accessible inside and outside of all the code. From this point on, we can reassign its value. All right, one last case here. Let's do this. And we really only need this. And this is just an extension of how we started this whole discussion. Here I'm creating a block of code immediately inside of my function. Here's the var keyword. So we're creating a local variable called myScope, but we're going to reference it outside of the block that we define here, the if statement. So let's see how that works. And so once again, proving that block scope is irrelevant, even though it's defined inside of the if statement. What happens is this process called hoisting, where JavaScript will look through the body of your code and it will hoist any variable declarations to the top of the function. So it'll make it available throughout the entire function. All right, and you can learn more about hoisting and the process of that in a more advanced video series, or many articles online. Okay, one last little tidbit of information. We haven't really talked about the document object model yet, but all variables that are defined at a global scope belong to the document object model window, which is the topmost object inside of the document object model. So we can do something like this. Let's do that. Let's get rid of everything inside here for the moment. Let's start afresh. All we have available right now is myScope equals global, and I'll go to the very bottom of this example and type in alerts window dot myScope. So window owns myScope, or we're going to test it anyway, and we're going to access the window object's myScope property or value. And let's see what we get if this actually indeed works. And it does. All right, and again, this might make a little more sense once we talk about the document object model in more depth. All right, so hopefully we've completely looked at all the cases with regards to global versus functional scope. Hopefully there's no ambiguity in your mind how this all works and the scope of variables that you define within your functions and outside of your functions, the use of var and the exclusion of the word var. Okay? All right, so let's continue on. You're doing great. We'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you.